Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with a review of a memoir by Canadian author John Glassco. And his memoir is called Memoirs of Montparnasse. But the question is it really a memoir or is it a novel masquerading as a memoir? Certainly a lot of the events in it are true, are facts, but there does seem to be a lot of fiction in it too, a lot of embellishment, as you would expect. So Glassco claims to have begun writing this memoir in 1928 at the age of 18, when he was spending some time in Europe, in France, in Paris particularly, at least for the first few chapters, in Paris with his friend Graham. Graham and John were students at McGill University who became bored with their privileged student life and decided to take off for the continent. But one of the keys to the whole work, I think, appears before they actually reach France. They stop off in London first, where they visit the home of the elderly Irish novelist George Moore. And George Moore is well known for a work titled The Confessions of a Young Man, which was first published in 1886 in French and then published in 1888 in English. And Confessions of a Young Man is based on the life of George Moore. It's generally taken to be fairly autobiographical. And in Confessions, the main character, who is named Dane here, heads off from the United Kingdom to Paris, where he spends several years absorbing the literary culture, absorbing the literary traditions, learning to write, and sort of struggling between his physical and carnal desire for enjoyment and his desire to create art. And in the end, he decides that he is probably not much of an artist, not much of a writer. And in reduced circumstances, returns to the United Kingdom. In this case, he goes to London, where he lives above the Strand and presumably becomes a writer. I have not read Confessions of a Young Man, but I added it to my Abe books cart and have ordered it. So I'll be reading that soon and seeing how that compares to this. But the key here is that it is a memoir about a young man who moves to Paris and struggles between the desire for pleasure and the desire to create, while also having interludes of literary criticism and philosophy. And this book is absolutely steeped with snippets of literary criticism and philosophy. Glassco has something to say about every author he meets and every author that comes up, and he is quite savage about it. There's one particular quote here where I read it and I was just like, damn, you could not be more blunt with your opinion on a friend's work. So he and Graham reach Paris and they soon become friends with a writer by the name of Robert Ullman, or Bob as they call him. And Glassco maintained that all of Bob's novels, all of Bob's works are essentially the same thing. And Bob even gives him a couple of his published works to read. He says, he gave me 2 of his published books, a companion volume and Village. I found it hard to say what I thought of them. I would have liked to admire them, but it was impossible. He just says, it was impossible for me to like my friend's work. And he's got some very savage things to say about the works of Ernest Hemingway, about James Joyce. There's one scene where there's a particular woman that he engages in a relationship with, and he ends up saying, it failed because our literary tastes were too different. And he lists off the authors that she likes and admires, and then basically says, they're all trash. These are the ones I like, and that's why it would never work. And it's quite funny throughout because he's very subtle about it. And it almost reminds me a bit of reading Proust, where if you're not paying close attention to the subtlety of some of the lines and some of the dialogue, you don't realize exactly how harsh and how savage the narrator is being. And so that was quite fun to read. And then on to the point of the philosophy. Throughout this book, there are sudden passages where Glassco is sort of musing on philosophical problems. There's one passage that sort of bursts out of nowhere, but seems to also fit perfectly within the book, where he suddenly says, what about that problem of the meaning of life? What about that problem of knowing if I even exist? And I'll see if I can find that passage now here. 213 I have in my notes here. Quite near the end, where he is wrapping things up. Yeah, so he says here, when he has reached sort of this destitute stage in his journey, he has used up all his money, he's on the verge of being ill, and on the verge of having to go back to Canada, having to go home, just as George Moore's character did in his Confessions of a Young Man. He says, "It was the velvet hour, the hour of meditation, when one dares try to crack the two ultimate riddles of man. Why are we here, and how do we really know we are here? These two questions, which lie at the root of the mystery of all being, had not been answered by my favorite philosopher, Bishop Berkeley. He had unaccountably bypassed them both. As a conscientious Christian, he had, of course, not seen fit to examine the first in a critical way, much less to give his private answer, which might have been interesting. As for the second, he had quite shirked the task of refuting that miserable Descartes, treating the question much as Schopenhauer had done, when he said Salafism was an impregnable castle that a good general had better leave untaken and press on to farther conquests, a simile that was both weak and evasive. Both philosophers, in declining to answer these questions, were obviously at the mercy of their temperaments. Their minds were similarly fixed on the cornerstones of their systems, the deity and the will. This, I told myself, was where I had the advantage on them." And he proceeds to sort of wander the streets of Paris here, sleep under a bridge, until a woman comes along and takes him in. And so based on the parallels that I see between what I know of George Moore's Confessions and John Glasgow's memoir here, I think it's a safe bet to say that Glassco based the structure and in part the inspiration for his memoir on Moore's own memoir. And so there you see already sort of a very novelistic literary format shaping his memoir. And this scene that we get within the memoir where Graham and John meet George Moore, John straight up says that he wanted to compose his own Confessions of a Young Man. And so he's literally telling us as the reader, this is what I'm doing. And then of course, if you look at it in its broader context, published in 1970, written from his recollections of those late years in the 1920s in Paris and in other cities in France. They spend some time in Nice and Monte Carlo, in those cities, based on the fact that he's focusing on this time period of the late 1920s. My mind is immediately drawn to other memoirs of that time period, memoirs by authors that he does in fact mention meeting in his own work. So of course, when we think of a memoir of 1920s Paris, our mind immediately goes to Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. And there's even a comparison made by Leon Adel, who writes an introduction to Glasgow's work, to Hemingway's A Movable Feast. Edel says that this book is like A Movable Feast, only more humane and more actual. And I definitely would say it's like A Movable Feast, only given as it's published at a later date, Glassco can get away with a lot more in terms of sex, in terms of the type of characters he brings into the story. There is prostitution in this book. There are scenes where he is engaging in prostitution. There are scenes where he is doing pornography to make money. There are scenes where he is going into clubs and dancing with other men. And he's quite crass about some of his discussions of sex in his memoir. Like A Movable Feast, it is in some ways one big party. Drink after drink, bar after bar, cafe after cafe, party after party, and anecdote after anecdote. I kept a running list of all the famous people, all the authors that Glassco brings up. We have everyone from Leo and Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, of course, Morley Callaghan, Harold Stearns, Diana Tree, Andre Breton, Robert Desnos, Ford Madox Ford, James Joyce. And some of these names, of course, are real authors. Some of them are pseudonyms for people who didn't feel he could include in this book under their real names because he is quite savage, quite harsh at times. And Glassco takes the time too to address incidents that were raised in Morley Callaghan's own memoir of the time. Morley Callaghan is another Canadian author from Toronto, and Glassco has some fun jabs to throw at the city of Toronto. Glassco himself is from Montreal. Worlds apart, those two cities, especially in this time. And Morley Callaghan wrote his own memoir of the time period. And Glassco sort of addresses some of the incidents that are brought up within Callaghan's own memoir, including the incident where Callaghan is said to have knocked out Hemingway in a boxing match, something that Hemingway was quite frustrated about, and apparently it led to a rupture in the friendship between Callaghan and Hemingway. Callaghan was much closer a friend to F. Scott Fitzgerald than he was to Hemingway, but he did spend some time with Hemingway in Paris, to the point where they did engage in a friendly boxing match, and Glassco sort of passes it off here, saying he had heard about that time that perhaps Callaghan had knocked Hemingway out, or was it just giving him a bloody nose? He says Callaghan didn't specify. And so he's sort of like bringing all this drama into his own memoir. Throughout, it's just this really witty and humorous memoir, so witty and humorous to the point where it doesn't really matter whether it's fact or fiction, what's embellished and what's not. It's just something to be enjoyed. And I want to read part of the opening chapter here just because it is so good. So the memoir begins in the winter of 1927 in Montreal, when John and his friend Graham are students at McGill University, and they have convinced their parents to let them drop out of university, which would have been quite a thing in 1927. You can sort of guess the number of people who actually got to go to university at that point in time, and here they are just throwing it away because they find it too boring. But anyway, they drop out of university, or at least John does. I think Graham may still be doing some courses of some sort, but John says, Glassco says, "We took a rundown apartment on Metcalfe Street and found work in the Sun Life Assurance Company of Canada. In our spare time, I threw myself into composing surrealist poetry," and he continued planning the great Canadian novel. But it was on A Dream of Paris that our ideas were vaguely but powerfully concentrated. This kept us going. Without it, we could not have faced the daily routine of rising at 8 o'clock every morning. bathing in a small gritty bathtub, dressing without any attention to the niceties, and stumbling down the icy street to an honest day's work. Our office pay was barely enough to live on, but the situation was soon improved by two of our college friends, Pratt and Petersham. Hearing we had taken an apartment downtown one evening, they put on their dark tubular overcoats and bowler hats and visited us with a proposal to pay $10 a month each for the privilege of taking women there one night a week, from 9 o'clock till 1 in the morning. The extra $20 was a help, and it was no hardship keeping away from the apartment until late on Wednesday and Saturday nights. Moreover, it soon turned out that Petersham was not using the place. His night was Wednesday, though he continued to pay. But a few more friends heard of his arrangement and applied for the same facilities. The apartment was warm, quiet, safe, fairly clean, and had a private street entrance. We were soon taking in $70 a month, which covered the rent. The difficulty was that I now had to compose my poetry in the early hours of the morning, and arrived at the Sun Life only half awake. By 10 o'clock, I would finish my morning work, posting up the 5 and 10 cent weekly premiums for burial insurance, and then go to bed down in one of the toilets in the basement, where I made myself a little nest in my ankle-length raccoon coat. After 2 months, I was summoned to the department's head office and told to ask for more work as soon as I had finished my allotment, and if there was none, at least to keep sitting decently at my desk. The prospect was so depressing that I gave my 2 weeks' notice to the personnel department that same day. We were thus once more in financial straits, and to make peace with my father, I called on him at the family mansion a week later. He suggested I return home, go back to McGill, and by hard work, make up the few months I had lost. Once again, I had to refuse. I had had enough of university life. I was more than ever determined to be a poet. I had known for a long time what a disappointment I was to my parents. My father had always wanted me to take up law. He pictured me in the robes of a judge. My mother, for her part, would have liked me to enter the church. She saw me as a bishop. These images and all that went with them now struck me with such renewed horror that I was able to stand my ground, which I began to realize was stronger than I thought. I hear you and your friend Taylor are running something very close to a house of ill fame on Metcalfe Street, said my father. Colonel Birdlime of McGill's Department of Extramural Affairs tells me it's common knowledge. I hear the same thing at the club. We take in a little rent. He was silent for a minute, stroking his great cleft chin. You're still set on a literary career. When I said I was, he offered me an allowance of $100 a month if I would live more discreetly. It was more than I expected. The way to Paris was now open. And so it begins on this very, very humorous note of Glassco explaining that the reason they were able to afford to go to Paris is because they were essentially running a house of ill repute, a brothel, if you will, out of their apartment. And that pretty much sets the tone for the whole book. Lots of sex, lots of drinking, lots of partying, and a little bit of literature. And so I think if you're someone who has enjoyed memoirs like Hemingway's A Movable Feast, like Morley Callaghan's memoir, the title of which I am forgetting right now, but if you've enjoyed those works, if you like stories of literary Paris, this might very well be the book for you, and it's much more funny, much more witty, and just a little bit more entertaining than A Movable Feast. So definitely something that I would highly recommend. And I do have plans, as I said, to read George Moore's memoir. And I'm thinking I will also try to pick up some of John Glasgow's poetry in translation. I do, of course, not read French, but many of his poems have actually been translated into English. So there's that. Definitely something I would highly recommend you pick up. And if you do want to pick it up, you're in luck, because it was produced in an edition by NYRB Books just a couple of years ago. So you do not have to search secondhand for the 1970 printing. You will be able to find it quite easily if you're at all interested.